Dr. M. David Litwa. I am really glad to have you back on the channel and do some chatting with you about some amazing things you're up to, but also really get into some of the topics we've been having on the channel for a long time: Corpus Hermeticum stuff, Marcion stuff, Demiurge stuff. You're again an incredible expert on those topics, and I lean heavily on your work to do the work that I do in terms of popular education and really diving deep into some of this material. So could you introduce yourself a little bit for people that maybe don't know you, and also maybe tell us a little bit about what you're up to?
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, I think that this is a awesome platform, and I'm so glad to be here with you and with all your audience. Um, I am very excited to say that the Evil Creator has now become affordable. He's on Audible, so watch out for him there. Um, Obviously, I mean, I have a day job, work at Boston College, but my passion is to make scholarship both accessible and affordable. And so I've got my website. It's basically, I offer four types of resources there. You can check that out. I put blog posts, and I have something that I've been working on for a long time as part of my job at Boston College, which is making scholarship accessible in a journal. But this journal is only available as a database to institutions. So my website now makes all of scholarship in early Christianity and Gnosticism available in summary form to the average person. What I mean by that is I've basically gone through and summarized everything that has come down the pipeline in the past 3 to 5 years and put it up there as article summaries and book reviews. And I'm constantly adding to that. So I think that's where you can find me. Obviously, you can find me also on Patreon, where I answer questions, I give early releases of videos, and I've put all my academic stuff there, and I do a lot of advising on Patreon. So if that's what you're after, by all means, go to that. And then I'm working on all these courses as well, which thanks to Dr. Sledge, many of you have taken my Marcion course, and I really appreciate that. And part of what we're going to talk about today is what I've been doing with the Hermetica, because I've been running a live Hermetic seminar with some initiates, and I'm very excited to tell you more about that as it develops into a course.
Yeah, so I guess to this the talk I want to have today is, sort of Corpus Hermeticum, Demiurge, Marcion, which is a real trifecta of material. So let's just dive right into the Corpus Hermeticum. You have a new class, a new seminar you're running on Corpus Hermeticum, which again, like you run these great classes, and so I want to learn a little bit more about the class you're running on the Corpus Hermeticum, and also sort of what you're working on there adjacent to just the seminar.
Well, what I'm trying to do is prepare everybody for the tsunami. And we've been waiting for this tsunami for about 5 years now. And we might be waiting, another year or so. But what we're all waiting for is the new edition of the Hermetica, the Corpus Hermeticum by Christian Wildberg, who's a professor of classics in Pittsburgh. And he is going to be completely re-editing from scratch, looking at the manuscripts and pulling out material that he considers to be glosses. And I'm sure that for many, including the titans in the field like Christian Bull and Wouter Hanegraaff, and for many spiritual practitioners of the Hermetica, what Wildberg is doing will be shocking and I think dismaying for many. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to prepare people to understand his methods, first of all, and to be able to have the tools to evaluate them. There is no doubt that Wildberg knows Greek and is an amazing and accomplished professor of classics. And he thinks that he can remove material based solely on philological grounds. And what is happening is that people, in order to evaluate his decisions, are going to have to know, are going to have enough of a grounding in philology, which is the love of language and the study of ancient languages, in order to evaluate what he's doing with the Hermetica. Because I think, to be honest, in many cases, he's right. Everybody agrees that the Hermetica is a very corrupt text. But there might be cases where he has gone too far, or he himself is not sure of how to proceed. Because I'll be frank with you, in Corpus Hermeticum 3, which I've been working on recently, it is just full of gibberish. Like there's just a string of gibberish in the manuscripts. And then the question is what to do about it. And in Copenhaver's translation, his strategy was just to try to make sense of the gibberish using the French, André Jean Festigier's translation, and kind of make it sound good, right? So Wilberg is going to have a fundamentally different approach to that. He's going to remove the material which doesn't make any sense, and is then going to present to you basically a brand new text which you've not really seen before. No one has really seen before. And so this is super important. And so part of the live seminar is to prepare people for that. And I'm creating a course, and essentially an evergreen course, that people can take at any time, while you're waiting for a bus or whatever, and enjoy some of the fruits of the research from the live seminar. And I'm not just a Corpus Hermeticum guy. Everyone who knows me knows that I approach these texts fundamentally differently than even people like Wouter Hanegraaff, because I see the Stobaean Hermetica as central, whereas a lot of Hermetic scholars want to push that stuff to the periphery. So the first part of the course is going to be prioritizing that Stobaean Hermetica, which I think is very important, because if you were just reading the Corpus Hermeticum, you might get the impression, as many 20th century researchers did, that this is sort of debased Greek philosophy. I think depending on where you start, I think the Egyptian element either becomes central or peripheral. And I think if you're reading the Stobaean Hermetica, there's no way, I think, to take Egypt out of the equation, right? I mean, we all agree that on some level there's a little bit of Egyptian local color in some of these tractates, but what really is Egyptian, right? And that's really the question. Another main theme of the course, what is Egyptian in this spiritual tradition? And then I would say the third theme is, how do Christians adapt and interact with the Hermetic tradition? So if you're interested in that side, you can get some of that as well.
Is there anything that jumps out at you? And again, this is sort of a preview of a preview, but anything that really jumps out at you in Corpus Hermeticum 1, 2, or 3 that there's a sort of canonical reading of that the new text really dispenses with?
Yeah, well, I'll say I'll say both. One area where I agree with Wildberg and one area where I disagree with Wildberg. And one area that I agree with Wildberg is in Corpus Hermeticum 1, famously at the end, the soul ascends through the spheres of the 7 planets. And in each planet, the soul will deposit its negative disposition into each of the planets. And Wildberg's point, I think, here is that this is an insertion of a later Hermetist who has a much darker picture of the cosmos than the original writer of Corpus Hermeticum 1, who described the creation as based on life and light. And I think he's basically right on that, because if you look at other tractates, and again, prioritizing the Stobaean Hermetica, the Stobaean Hermetica 29 is a poem about the planets. And one of the consistent things that we find in other Hermetica is that the planets are fundamentally givers of good gifts. We see this also in the Kori Cosmo, where humanity's creation, part of that is the planets get together and they give us good gifts. So what is so weird about Corpus Hermeticum 1 is that you have this scene at the end where it's assumed that the planets are negative and providing negative energies, and as if the Hermetic cosmos had been Gnosticized at some point. So I actually agree with Wildberg that that's probably an insertion. Now, what about an area of disagreement? Well, if you turn to Corpus Hermeticum 3, you have this, what Wildberg calls the genesis of a genesis. And in that passage, you have the creation of the world and of humanity and of animals. And what Wildberg does, interestingly, is he says, well, the focus of the Hermetica is always on humanity. So this creation of animals probably isn't original. And he has some philological reasons for that as well, like in terms of the characteristics of the language. But I think this is probably incorrect. And again, if you focus on the Steubean Hermetica, you do see that the Hermetists are interested in animals and they're regularly bringing up animals to compare with human beings. And the reason they compare them is because animals are like the example of how a creature would act without logos or
Mhm.
reason. And so they're constantly bringing up animals and talking about animal intelligence. So I think it's perfectly fine for a hermetist to be interested in the creation of animals. And so I keep that in the text, but Wildberg will remove the animals from Corpus Hermeticum 3. And all this is based on something I should have mentioned at the beginning, that I'm making my own translation of the Corpus Hermetica. One of the things that Wouter Hanegraaff said in his great book on Hermetic spirituality, I think, is that translation of the Hermetica is very difficult, and we don't really have a good English translation. And in many ways, maybe we can't have a good English translation because we can never really agree on how to translate things like nous, and that's okay. But I think what I'm trying to contribute through my translation is something in effect that counteracts Wildberg, because Wildberg reorders the texts according to the speakers, right? So we have, the traditional order, Corpus Hermeticum 1 to 18. 15, doesn't exist. It's just was taken out. Um, but we have the traditional order of 1 to 18, but there's nothing actually canonical about that order. It seems to have been just a decision of Byzantine scribes to order them in that way, and it's continued, by Ficino and later publishers of the Hermetica. So I think, based on research, primarily by Fowden and Bull, that we can reorder the tractates according to a path of spiritual progression and of introductory general topics, and then topics introducing the idea of conversion, and then topics introducing initiation, and then preparation for a greater initiation, the greatest initiation being rebirth, and then the final group of tractates being how do you see the world if you are reborn. And I'm trying to produce this new order. I'm actually not going to try to change the numbers. I'm still going to use the old numbers, but I'm going to put them in a new order.
And Walter Hanegraaff also does something like that with his sort of spiral organization. And again, I've always found this interesting. This question of what is what is there's sort of three axes. There's what is the authentic and inauthentic Hermetica, and then there's the axis of which order should they be read in, and then there's the axis of within any text, which is actually what is living and what is dead Hermetica. I
Hmm.
just find that to be a fascinating thing, and of course that intersects with all the other texts like the Stobaean fragments or everything else. So it is a multi-dimensional puzzle. What do you
Right.
think? What do you think is a big misconception about the Hermetica? Like, now that you have this new text in front of you, you're working on your own translation. What do you think is the I don't want to say the big thing that people get wrong because I don't like to frame things in terms of that. But what do you think is going to be in the long arc of things? What do you think is going to be the conception that we have of the Corpus Hermeticum now or Hermeticism now? And what do you think it's going to be? What do you think is going to be? going to have to be put on the shelf, yeah, in 10 years down the line, something like that.
Well, I think there's many things, but one thing we could mention is what people don't quite realize about the Hermetica is how deeply corrupt that they are. And this really only becomes clear, unfortunately. It's completely invisible when you're working with a translation.
Hmm.
Okay. I mean, even editors who provide copious notes, like in Copenhaver's editions, there's no notes at the bottom of the text. You've got to turn to the back of the book, and very few people turn to the back of the book. But if you do turn to the back of the book, you do realize that Copenhaver struggled very severely with some things, and he was always telling you, what an editor has changed. And I don't think people sufficiently realize this, that I think I say we're all preparing for the tsunami, and there's going to be people extremely shocked and dismayed by what Wildberg has produced. But one of the things to keep in mind is that everyone agrees, every editor, and you can see this if you're looking at the critical edition of the Greek text, everyone agrees that the Hermetica, as they've come down to us, are extremely corrupt. And for years, ever since really Reitzenstein and many, going all the way back to the Renaissance,
Yeah.
there have been intervening editors who have been changing things in order to make the text make sense. So when we're reading the translation in the 21st century, we're reading a text that has undergone heavy repair, but most people are not at all aware of that. A kind of, I think that the tendency of practitioners is to think that these kind of came down to us pure. But there's no reason to think so, because the transmitters of the text, they're not Hermetists themselves. They're Christian scribes,
Right.
primarily. And so those people aren't part of a Hermetic community per se. And they really just kind of were interested in Hermes as a witness to Jesus, and they pulled anything that they could to support that. But it is the case that even Hermetists in late antiquity, they seem to have changed and undergone change. So the interventions that Hermetists made in their own texts has also changed the nature of the text. So there's different kinds of corruption that we need to be aware of. And maybe I shouldn't even use the word corruption, because that might sound too negative. Sometimes the texts are just simply changed, or someone decides to add something. And, if that someone happens to be a Hermetist, well, I guess, they have every right to add something if they want. But all that would mean is that we don't have the text as originally written. So we could call that a modification if we didn't want to use the term corruption, which is fine. But we do have a problem, and we need to be aware of what we're reading. I think, in 10 years, assuming that Wildberg does come out with his edition, I think there'll be an initial shock and a flurry of reviews and evaluations. And I think things will kind of settle down. I think the majority of scholars will pick and choose what they want to take from Wildberg, and the majority of Hermetic practitioners will just kind of ignore it. But I'm hoping that you won't, because I think there's a lot of good that comes out of good philological scholarship. And, as I like to say, if you know the life of Brian, your spiritual tradition can be based on a misperception. And that famous scene, of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and people, 100 yards away are hearing, "Blessed are the cheesemakers." Someone can stand up and give a profound and awe-inspiring spiritual interpretation of "Blessed are the cheesemakers," but it would be probably spiritually more valuable if we gave a spiritual interpretation of what was actually said. And so this is the goal of the Hermetica, right? We want to found our spirituality on good philology, and we can do that. Those things aren't opposed at all.
Right. Yeah, and it will be interesting. I'm also excited to see it, and and sort of I think a lot of us are on bated breath to see what this tsunami looks like, and um, yeah, and again, there's this whole question of of corruption, or sometimes what I refer to the Byzantine filter. What did the text look like by the time it even got to Byzantium? And this also gives lie to the idea that there was a homogenous hermeticism that ever existed. In the same way that this has well been debunked in Christianity and Judaism. Of course, there were lots of Christianities in Judaism. We all know that now. But the idea that there might have been hermeticisms, and that the
Mm,
texts that we contain, that have come down to us, uh, may represent many hermetic voices, which may in antiquity perhaps didn't even agree with each other. And so that should not surprise anyone. I think anyone who's interested in the Hermetica, I think is gonna have to be prepared for that reality. And I think that should be
yes.
unsurprising to any of us. There's no Christianity or Hermeticism or Gnosticism, and even talking about communities is extremely tenuous, given
Mhm.
the great kind of work that's been done. So, David, I guess I want to jump down to this question, and this may be a little bit outside of your wheelhouse, but maybe it is and maybe it isn't. But I'm interested in your thoughts on the question of the relationship between this document that now exists in translation as the Conversations in the House of Life, sometimes called the Demotic Book of Thoth, and the Corpus Hermeticum. And assuming that these two documents, and the translators and the redactor, or the translators and the editors of the Conversations in the Book of Life, they gesture in the direction that there's probably some connection between these texts, and yet they say, well, we really can't find any. And I'm wondering if you have any reflections on that. That the pendulum has turned in the direction of a very strong Egyptian origin, and that means Egyptian, but not just in terms of the land, but in terms of the 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 religious traditions and the soteriological traditions of indigenous Egyptian religion. And we have at least a fragmentary text representative of that tradition. And I'm wondering to what degree you think we have any connection between the Conversations in the House of Life, as it's entitled by its editors, and the Hermetic literature, whether it's Stobaean fragments, or the Corpus Hermeticum, or any other of the vast amount of literature attributed to the thrice great Hermes.
Well, I think in terms of content, people will struggle to make comparisons, but there's two ways that the Book of Tote can help us, and it can help awaken our imagination to view to imagine or reimagine what kind of people were using the text. And the second way it can help us is by showing us that the dialogue structure, is not something that has to be Greek,
Mhm.
right? So people who think that the Hermetica are just debased Platonism tend to say, well, they got the dialogue form from Plato, and maybe they did, but it is the case that in native Egyptian tradition, a something like a philosophical dialogue in terms of the genre is well attested, and manuscripts of the Book of Tobit are from the Roman period, so all of this is concurrent, and it's perfectly plausible, I think, to imagine, and unfortunately we have to imagine this, but to imagine real, what we would call natural philosophy and philosophy, metaphysics, science, being spoken about and discoursed about in Egyptian temples, which are houses of life, I think that's perfectly plausible. If we follow Christian Bull, basically we can make a distinction between those conversations within the temple by employed priests, and those conversations that are outside the temple by unemployed Egyptian priests who are now looking for new audiences.
Mhm.
And if we imagine the conversations in the House of Life as the things that an employed Egyptian priest would talk about in terms of what they were interested in their temple rituals, and things like animals and stars, and I mean, they talked about really anything. Like hermetism and the knowledge of Thoth has always been comprehensive. It's always tried to be like a theory of everything. There's no coherent center. But when priests begin to lose their jobs and they're also bilingual. They're Greek speaking, and they're looking for new audiences. And they're also trying to prove that, you know, the origin of Greek philosophical traditions is actually Egyptian. Well, I think it's entirely unsurprising that they would write something like the treatises of our Corpus Hermeticum, because that's more ancient science. It's more ancient theology. It's more ancient spirituality, shifted to a new audience and given a new kind of philosophical sounding rhetoric. And it's interesting, there is a passage in the Hermetica where, you know, our Hermetica, I say that, following Bull, if you follow Bull, that they're unemployed priests, writing our Hermetica, who are functioning more like philosophers, freelance philosophers. They specifically say that we're not going to hold this conversation in the temple. We're going to hold it hoop by thrust. We're going to hold it in the open air. And so it's not like they feel alienated from the temple, but they themselves realize that they're not in the temple anymore,
Mhm.
and that for them the temple is nature itself and the universe, and they are coming to grips with that, sort of like Jews in antiquity came to grips with the fact that, oh, they don't have a physical temple on earth anymore. It wasn't because they were unemployed, but that the Romans destroyed it. And so then they had to imagine, as Philo did even prior to 70, the cosmos as God's temple, and or reimagine the temple in a heavenly area, and then reimagine their worship space. It's kind of what these Hermetists are doing when they talk about nature.
Right. And also I think it's, if I remember correctly, lector priests rotate in and out, right? It's like
Mhm.
they work one part of the year, then they sub out and they come in and out, and you get the sense that that some of these guys rotate out and they need to make ends meet, and so what do? They might,
Yeah,
yeah, they,
that's a good point. Yeah, they might not be fully employed throughout the year.
right.
Yeah,
And that they, but they're not getting a state pension perhaps, or not a full pension when
right.
they're unemployed. The same with the levy and mass system that that built some of the great, the great architecture there. That they're agricultural workers some part of the year and stonemasons the rest. And these lector priests might be also rotating in and out. And when they're out of the temple, they might be spreading some of their wisdom. So
Mm,
yeah, again, David, I'm really looking forward to one. I haven't got the chance to take a look at your class yet, but I'm definitely gonna get into that. I've done your Marcion class, which I really enjoyed and have recommended to people, and also really looking forward to your translation of the Corpus Hermeticum and how you come to present the material in the way that you do, and also just sort of, we were talking a little bit behind the scenes about sort of what does a publication of something like that look like. And so I'm also excited about this new emerging conversation among some of us Ronin academics, to some degree, the lector priests who are rotating in and rotating out.
yeah,
uh,
that's us, right?
yeah, that's us. So, what do us lector priests who've rotated out, and when we want to publish a little bit, what does that look like? So we're having some conversations, folks, in the background about that, and trust me, it's all in the interest of serving our communities that we care about deeply, in terms of empowering folks with educational content. So I'm really looking forward to your work, and I'm looking forward to not just your work, but also the thinking going behind getting it in people's hands in a just and equitable way. And so, just want to
Mhm.
really appreciate the fact that you're also thinking along those lines as well. And um,
Exactly. Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
so,
Appreciate
so
that.
let's turn to the elephant in the room, the demiurge in the room. I've been running this series on the demiurge and leaning on your scholarship and really trying to push your fantastic book, The Evil Creator. And one of the things I want to kind of not exactly push you on, but sort of get you to sort of think a little bit more out loud with the audience, is that you do a really great job of setting up the demonization of Yahweh and how that happens, and then the shift to Marcion and the conversation about the this that odd section in John 8. And you weave, I think, a very compelling narrative about this is the matrix and this is the development of the evil creator, especially as it emerges in this Egyptian situation and in this John 8 situation and in this Marcionite situation. And yet, most people know of the evil creator, the malevolent demiurge, primarily through literature like the Apocryphon of John, in which the demiurge, the evil creator, is downstream of a much larger mythological system, and it seems like perhaps the Apocryphon of John is composed in a specifically Egyptian milieu, and Marcion is developing his thought either in connection maybe with an Egyptian, but mostly in his milieu there in what is now Turkey, Asia Minor. Um, and I guess what I want to get you to sort of extrapolate on or think about with me, and maybe lay up some ideas out is, to what degree do you think Marcion's thinking about the evil creator and the Egyptian situation with the vast mythology that emerges with the Apocryphon of John, or the Valentinians, or any other group you want to throw in, as much as those are groups? Um, what's the connection there? I'm really curious. When I the book kind of reads to me like a cliffhanger. I'm like, all right, we have all the pieces, and then what? Where did we get this other story? And so I
Mm,
guess what I want to ask you is, you know, how do we get to Egypt? How do we get to the Apocryphon of John? How do we get to apparently or a textual tradition shared by people like Valentinus and the authors of the Apocryphon of John? How do we get to that version of the evil creator, in your opinion, that has this other much more thick mythological structure?
mm. Well, let me first say that I feel like I fought the archons even to get the evil creator on Audible. Oxford University Press, in its wisdom, gives me all of a 3% royalty for that book. And I reveal that to your audience just to show what I consider to be a very stark injustice, because I worked for so many years on that book and only to earn 3% per copy. And then to have them sell it for, initially at least, it was well over 100 US dollars. They are not my fans. But then when I tried to put it on Audible, they blocked and delayed and obstructed me for over a year as I continued to pester them
Academic
over email.
publishing is a cartel, folks. I don't know if anyone else will say it, but I will say it. Academic publishing is an unethical, monstrous cartel that exploits authors and exploits people who want to learn.
So the very fact that I've made it now 1495, I think is a tremendous victory, and it's my own personal victory over the archons. But to get to your question, I really see, I would answer it as a historian would, that is by focusing on chronology, right? Um, Marcion really is first. What
Hmm.
you're seeing in the Secret Book of John or Apocryphon of John is really early third century material, right? And you can come back to me and say, well, Irenaeus has the Apocryphon of John. Well, no, he really doesn't. He has what looks like a piece of what I call the Father Discourse and the origin of Yaldabaoth. But his version is clearly different than any version in our manuscripts, and his version ends with the boast of Yaldabaoth, and then it's done. Um, so whatever Irenaeus has, it's something on the way toward evolving into what we call the Secret Book of John. So the full-blown Sethian evil creator Yaldabaoth is really a third century kind of thing, early third century kind of thing, which is really important to understand because that means that Marcion is actually the innovator. Now, there's a lot of people, both historically and the study of Gnosticism, and even today, April DeConnick will say that there was a pre-Christian Gnosticism and that it was born in Egypt based on reflection on the Atum myth. And I don't, I personally, I mean, I enormously respect her as a scholar and she has amazing creativity, but I don't think there's anything to that. I think Marcion is first for Christians to come up with the idea of an evil creator, and he does that essentially independent of Egypt. Now, this might seem surprising because the first part of the book is to show that the evil creator idea had deep origins in Egypt as an
Hmm.
anti Jewish discourse, right? And that is true, but and I think, it's not that Marcion would not have come in contact with that. I mean, he is a shipmaster. He is the Mediterranean is his oyster. I don't find anything implausible that he traveled well and all around the Mediterranean, including Egypt. But I think his fundamental insights are biblical. And so he's coming to that material first as a Christian. And that's important to recognize. It's the Sethians who are realizing how deep this is in the Egyptian tradition. And really, if we were a simple comparative, a historian of comparative religion, we would say that the evil creator as an idea, that's kind of everywhere, really. I mean, in even in here where I am in Australia, this Aboriginal myths dealing with negative demiurges, and you could say the same about African mythology, and maybe you could say the same about Native American mythology. I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't even call it mythology. We should just call it lore. But there's trickster creators. There's demonic or daimonic, as I like to say, entities who are ambiguously bad or good. So there's that going on. But I think Marcion's innovation, and we can date him very securely to the 140s.
Sure.
His innovation is to say that, yep, I read the Septuagint, which is the standard Greek translation of the Hebrew text in his time, and I've concluded that God is evil, and here's why.
Or
And
the
I
creator is
think
evil, at least.
that the creator is evil.
Right.
Yes, that's better to be precise, because I think for Marcion, the creator is actually, he just claims to be God, but he's
Right.
not really
Right.
God. So
Right. It's more Tertullian and those guys who try to make Marcion to be a bitheist or discredit him by being a polytheist or something.
that's right. That's my position. And so I think, it's the same thing that I've argued for Valentinus. There's a strong wing in scholarship that goes back now to Leighton and his student David Brackey, which says that there was a Gnostic school of thought, and it was prior to Valentinus, which means that it's in early second century Alexandria.
Hmm.
I just don't see that.
Hmm.
I just don't see that. I see Valentinus as just like Marcion, as an innovator in his time.
Right.
And I think what we're referring to as the Gnostic school of thought is the Sethians. And Sethians really do most of their work in the very late and early third century. Very late second and early third century.
Right.
So most of what we call Sethian texts are going to be in that period. And so that means that they are basing themselves on the insights that have already been made by Valentinus and by Marcion. And certainly by the late second century, when Marcion is introduced, or Marcionite Christianity is introduced into Egypt by a man called Apelles, he's already Valentinianized Marcionism. So the creator, is specifically not called a god. He's an angel, and he's not purely evil. He's just. Those
Hmm.
are modifications of Marcionite thought that have been made by Apelles based on Valentinian traditions. So by the time you're in late second century Alexandria, that's where you're getting this melting pot of ideas. And who's ever writing the sacred book of John is then coming back to what is more of a purely Marcionite position, but having a different attitude toward the Septuagint, thinking that he can revise the Septuagint and create, well, what we refer to as a new myth, but what for them is just another foundation story, just another creation story that had authority. So, that's what Alexandria is. It's what it's always been. It's that place where East and West has met. It's that place where not just East and West, but people coming in from all directions have met. And this luxuriant growth of creation mythology, as we put it, we find this also in the Hermetica. It's the Cosmo. They want to talk about creation. Corpus Hermeticum 3 is about creation. Poimandres is about creation.
Sure.
The Secret Book of John is about creation. They're all it's like they're all telling creation myths at exactly this time, and that's not a mistake. And they all probably know each other on some level, but they all have variants that of how they want to envision creation and the creator. So it's not an easy story to tell. I'll be honest with you.
Right.
And
Yeah, and
another book could be written to just to make that story more coherent. Yeah.
I'd be curious to, again, I have some thoughts about that as well. But again, I go back to the Irenaeus question, right? And I think Irenaeus is writing in the 180s. And if we get sort of a proto Secret Book of John material already in the 180s, and Marcion's, and a good bit earlier, Valentinus is a good bit earlier. It seems to me like a shockingly fast turnaround to get such a Baroque mythology. um, that the Apocryphon of John and the system of syzygies that you get in Valentina seems at least to echo at least some indigenous Egyptian mythology. They also tend to like syzygies. Yeah, it'd be interesting. Again, I'm thinking of sort of Matt Baker and the useful charts. As much as possible to sort of get what does a useful chart look like of all these influences and that kind of thing. And I guess that leads me into my second question, and that is, when Marcionism lands in Egypt, assuming that there is no pre-Christian Gnosticism. Let's just put just to all things being equal, saying there is no pre-Christian Gnosticism. What does Marcionism look like um, as it enters Egypt? Because there's no evidence that Marcion went there, although it seems very likely that he could have. But when Marcionism as a Christianity enters Egypt, do you think it enters Egypt as already Valentinized, or do you think it undergoes that process while in Egypt?
Well, I think that's a both and because Apelles, focusing on concrete individuals,
Mm,
Apelles is probably trained by Marcion in Rome. Valentinus was in Rome. So there's Valentinian currents going on in both Rome and Alexandria.
right.
But certainly when Apelles does make it to Alexandria, I think he comes specifically as a missionary. There's nothing that says that, but that's my speculation. And I think he just says, I'm going to start a Marcionite church here.
Right. It's a place
And
to compete. That's where you compete in Christianity, is Alexandria.
it's a place they compete. It's exactly what modern religious movements do today.
Mhm.
The Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons are always out there trying to expand the territory, and they understand that they're in the minority, so that gives them all the more motivation to want to spread. So, and I do think when Apelles arrives in Alexandria, that he looks around and it's a heavily Valentinianized area with a lot of Valentinian influence. We know this from multiple sources, and Origin says that he was living in a house with a Valentinian, and we've got the excerpts from Theodotus, which Clement says is which he excerpts, and that's probably Alexandrian. So whoever Theodotus is, we don't really know. But this guy Paul was a Valentinian. Um, he was not a friend of Origen, but I mean, he may have been originally. Who knows? We know that Ambrose, Origen's patron, was a Valentinian. Heraclian was a Valentinian, possibly wrote the commentary on the Gospel of John, very first one in Alexandria. So we know that it's hot there. The Nicene author is in Alexandria, I think. He's influenced by Valentinianism.
Mhm.
So if you're going to do anything
Also very
theologically,
syncretistic, like a very, again, like thinking about sort of Egyptian Christian syncretism, whatever that means, that you could incorporate mythological elements from the Egyptian indigenous Egyptian mythology, and the Nicene preacher seems very comfortable with that in a way that I think many modern Christians would find deeply uncomfortable, but was probably just the order of the day.
yeah, so I think you have to imagine a situation where also in ancient culture, old things are good.
Hmm.
And so everybody acknowledges that Egyptian culture is the oldest. They kind of had debates about that. But most people did conclude that. I would say. And so, if you can imagine Sethianism as a kind of Egyptianizing or re Egyptianizing, depending on your perspective, movement, why would it be useful to Egyptianize in the late second and early third century? Well, it would be to appear old, right? I mean, the Jewish scholars, they did their best to show that Moses was really, really old. But when you read figures like Manetho, um, you know, you realize that, Jewish history doesn't really it doesn't stand a chance against Egyptian history
Sure.
when you really know it, because the pharaohs, the Egyptians knew that this went back thousands and thousands of years, and they could name their pharaohs going back, 3,000 years. So that was hard for people to compete with. So how do you want to authorize your material? Well, on some level, the Christians were Judaizing the material, um, you know, appropriating the Hebrew Bible as the Septuagint for themselves. But what other Christians did is, who had a more ambiguous relationship with the Hebrew Bible, is they Egyptianized
Hmm.
their material. And so, yeah, like, I think, and they fooled us a little bit, right? Because this whole idea of Cyzicus, I mean, it's Neo-Pythagorean as well, but you're right that it has an Egyptian analog. So one could think that, oh, wow, maybe this stuff really does go back 3,000 years, and you could say that. But what I think is really happening is, no, they're very intentionally Egyptianizing the material because that builds their authority. And they're
Right.
doing that at the very time where you know, they're familiar with the Egyptian traditions, and they're very intentionally saying, this is old ancient truth, and I'm going to claim it for my own tradition. I'm going to take what I'm going to take. I got yelled at recently over the internet on the use of the term cultural appropriation. Uh, but that's what it is. They were culturally appropriating, and I'm not necessarily saying that that's bad or good. I think most people
I mean,
nowadays would say
I think they
better.
were probably indigenous Egyptian converts. I mean, I don't think they were culturally I think that they were literally Egyptian people saying and also, like, because again, Christianity has a PR problem. Their Messiah is relatively newly dead, executed in the most embarrassing way possible. That's a huge PR problem from the Roman imagination of what authenticates a religion. And so what better to say than actually the execution of Jesus is just actually the most recent moment in a cosmic history that reaches back and has this sort of uh, verifiably Egyptian roots. It seems to me that it's actually not it may not be cultural appropriation at all, assuming that you actually have indigenous Egyptians saying Jesus is part of our story, uh,
Sure. Yeah,
not the other
absolutely.
way around.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. That's very important to remember, that someone like the Nassian preacher could very well be Egyptian by heritage.
Mhm.
He could be a native, or some sort of, as was common, mix. I
Mhm.
mean, it's like, in America, it's fun to see, if you're Swedish and German and you have a little bit of Irish in you. But the fact is, we're all a bunch of mutts. I mean, I mean, we're not really anything anymore. But it's fun to do the genealogy. Of course, that was also happening in Alexandria as well, where there's Egyptians, Greeks, Macedonians, Indians. I mean, what are you?
Right. Yeah, yeah. And again, I like this idea that and I think I've said this before, that Christians agreed upon sort of a very loose network of ideas that Jesus is important, his birth, his teachings, his death and resurrection are all important, but the rest is basically up for grabs. Whatever important means, you kind of shoehorned all kinds of stuff. And I think about the range of someone from whoever composed something like the books of you and Pistis Sophia, all the way over to someone like I don't, Athanasius. Uh, It's hard to see from my point of view, to see much in the way of what in the world they could have shared a conversation about, but both completely would have identified themselves as Christian. And just to me, it shows the enormous amount of, and I think this has probably been true when Christianity was introduced into Europe. I bet there would have been Gauls who would have gladly told you, or Germans who would have gladly told you that Jesus and Woden are going to fight the snake at Ragnarok or something. There would have probably been this period of intense syncretization and shoehorning of mythologies to make things work. And the fact that we would find that in Egypt is, I guess, totally unsurprising to me that Christianity needed mythology, but you needed to. None of that made any sense outside of a mythology, and the so-called Orthodoxy leaned into the Israelite mythology, and some folks leaned into the Egyptian mythology, and that strikes me as totally. We should be utterly unsurprised by that.
That's right. Yeah, and those debates are still going on today. I mean,
Sure.
essentially, what we call heresy is to my mind Alexandrian theology that's
Mhm.
been um, polemicized. Um, and as what is Voucher's term for this? It's sort of like rejected
Yeah,
knowledge.
redacted knowledge.
It's
Yeah, I think we should just
rejected
go to.
knowledge.
We should just start calling Christianity Irenaeanism.
Yeah,
um,
right.
or Athanasianism, because I think that if we started doing that, it would be the sort of the punch in the head that we need to get past all of this, Valentinianism, Sethianism. Like, yeah, I don't know what that, that's just Irenaeanism. Um,
Right.
you know, I,
Which in his epicenter was Rome.
right,
So I mean, we could call Orthodoxy Roman and heresy Alexandrian and see how that worked. Because although that's a generalization, I think that is what's going on. A lot of what we call heresy is just the response to Alexandrian theology moving west.
hmm,
And yeah, it turns out that Roman Christians, yeah, they took the Jewish stuff
right,
in order to seem old, and Alexandrian Christians were like, I'm not sure I like the
right.
Septuagint.
Yeah,
I'm going to go to this Egyptian stuff.
yeah. We're gonna opt out.
That's
We're gonna
older anyway. So,
Right, right. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that there probably wasn't enormous, like after 117 or whatever, when there was the big pogrom in Alexandria, the Jewish population is basically massacred and is no longer has the cultural cachet they would have had prior to that. And that's really when, sort of all these Gnostic variants begin to emerge. That's just not true in Rome. There's a continuously functioning, vibrant Jewish community in Rome, down to this day. I mean, the Roman Minhag, um, dates before the temple was destroyed, and they still have
yep,
elements of Jewish ritual in the Roman way of celebrating Judaism that are foreign to me when I go there. That are like, yeah, we have no memory of where this comes from. It probably goes back to the days when the temple was still there. Um, so
precisely.
so I imagine like the pogrom that happens in the second century has so much to do with the fact that ultimately the reliant on the Jewish mythology becomes has less cultural cachet, than perhaps it did in Rome, where the Jewish community there remained vibrant and remained a symbol of sort of ancient, Eastern religious foundationalism that the Romans begrudgingly had to accept at some level, despite the fact that
Exactly.
so.
Exactly. Yep.
So I think there's
Yep.
some of that. I guess another question I have, just sort of wrap up this side of it, is, one of the things we have in Marcionism is we do have these fragments of his teachings. We have fragments of what we think of his apostolicon. We have fragments of his other texts. We have these fragments, and I guess one question is like, what are some resources to get into those texts? The Roth text and other kinds of texts like that unfortunately are very expensive. But any of the recommendations you have to sort of get into the meat of what we have from Marcion, but also, does Marcionism leave us any speculation about where this demiurge comes from? That the evil creator, rather, I should say, that Marcion posits its entity, but one of the interesting things is that we're never given, as far as I know, Marcion never seems to provide an etiology for that entity, which I think actually is a prompt for later theological developments, either in Marcionism or what becomes Gnosticism. But I guess the question, yeah, there's two questions. Text that you recommend for people to get into Marcion's actual writings as far as we can reconstruct them. But then also this other more speculative question. Any sense of if you were to ask a Marcionite in the third century, fourth century, like, yeah, you guys posit this evil creator, but where did he come from?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, if most people are looking for a good translation of Marcion's Evangelion, and so I always point them to Jason Badun's translation, the First New Testament. I think that that's still the gold standard, even though now it's 11 years old and he's done a Greek text. And so we're waiting on his update of the English because he's changed things.
Mhm.
Um, there is available now just a separate translation of Matthias Klinghart's oldest gospel. But one of the things that's important to recognize there is that that's not really a translation of Marcion's text. That's Matthias Klinghart really trying to get to what he considers to be the oldest gospel,
Mhm.
which he thinks that Marcion uses. But his methods are fundamentally different than Badun. So whereas Badun is going into, we have 15 to 20 people who quote from Marcion's text. And so the way that we reconstruct it is we just string together all the
Right.
quotes, right? And so Badun is looking primarily for quotes, but what Klinghart is doing, and what people like Mark Bilby are doing, is they're also going into the manuscripts of Luke, and they're trying to say what was the oldest gospel,
Right. This is a
what they think
Marcionite
is the oldest
priority
gospel,
kind of stuff.
which then secondarily Marcion used.
Right.
And so if you're looking for a translation of Marcion's Evangelion, I actually wouldn't say I don't go to Klinghart, whose methods of reconstruction aren't really aiming to get at Marcion, and they are speculating based on the surviving manuscripts of Luke as to what could be in Marcion's text, and they're filling in gaps in a way that not everyone agrees with. The most conservative text and the most rigorous reconstruction is by Dieter Roth. Unfortunately, he hasn't produced any English translation.
Right.
Um, and it would be impossible anyway because his text is so bare bones, it's not
Mhm.
a connected narrative anymore. So that's where we are. And so I say for that middle ground, always go to Badun.
Mhm.
Um, I've got a forthcoming book on Marcion. I've been waiting for it to come out. Um, I'm trying to replace Harnack, but in the beginning of my book, I go through, what reconstructions are reliable.
Mhm.
So I'm hoping that when that comes out, that can serve as a useful guide so that you'll understand a bit more about the principles that go into the reconstruction. And, what we're all trying to avoid is, the conservative evangelical Christians who are saying, oh, well, you can't agree on a reconstruction, so it must not be any good anyway, so I can just ignore this guy as I have been doing the past 1800 years. um,
Worse than
but yeah,
ignoring.
the
If
point
only
is,
if only they ignored him.
I mean, trust me, yeah, they have been trying to ignore Marcion for a
Yeah.
long, long, long time.
No, people
Um,
hate to admit that Marcion and Valentinus are basically like that's your first gospel and that's your first theologian. I hate,
right.
again,
Yeah,
as far as literature we have,
exactly. Yeah.
there's Apollos and stuff like that. But when you have to be like, I hate to tell you, but like this might be the ground floor, historically speaking. That seems to irk them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
In terms of construction, yeah, all the earliest Christian theologians, they're all Alexandrians
yeah,
and they're all Gnostics. They're
yeah,
Basilides, Carpocrates, and Valentinus, and we can throw in Prodicus as well. They were doing theology before the Romans. While the Romans were still in diapers, to use that. You know, while people like Irenaeus were in diapers.
right, absolutely.
Basilides was you know, in the stratosphere, contemplating the greatness of the monadic infinite God. So yeah, that's the truth, and these are the people orthodoxy would prefer to forget. Yep.
Yep. Yeah, it's what do they call it? Inconvenient facts. Facts are stubborn things. and they're
Mm,
often highly inconvenient.
yeah.
I guess the second question is also sort of laying on the floor, is if you were to ask a Marcionite, in the and then we know the Marcionite church lasted well into in the East, at least it lasted for several centuries. Who knows how long it lasted? Frankly, I still think it's alive in the minds of most Christians. I think you ask. I think I made the joke that growing up in Mississippi, I met more Marcionites than I met Orthodox people, because they have Kumbaya Jesus and mean angry Old Testament God. I'm like, it's just a bunch of Mississippi Marcionites. I think Marcion's alive and well, despite the orthodoxy. But if you were to ask a Marcionite in the you know fourth century, at Aleppo or wherever, Odessa, wherever out there somewhere in the hinterland or in the big cities even, where did the evil creator come from? You get a sense of what they might have said, or what the Marcionite position was on the origin of the evil creator.
Yeah, well, so we have an Arabic writer, An Nadim, who writes an encyclopedia basically, and it says that there's still Marcionites in tenth century Iran, and there are now, as we speak, two Marcionite churches competing with each other that are official, that they have websites, and they have congregations, and so that's an interesting fact.
That they're
But
competing with each other makes them official. That's what you have to have. You have to have at least two. If there
they-
were just one, I wouldn't trust it.
yeah, I mean, it's always been based on polemic anyway. So,
Syzygies, yeah.
um, yes. So I think the trend that we see in late antique Marcionite thought is that they tend to get more philosophically astute. So they tend to think more in terms of principles, and um, they never come up with a creed. They unfortunately they don't. Well, maybe fortunately they don't organize in that sort of way, but they begin talking about principles, and like the principle of matter and the principle of the highest God and the demiurgic principle. And I think the general trend is more of an Apellian trend. Like Apelles just made clear what I think was already implicit in Marcionite thought, that the creator is pretty much something like the devil. He is an angel, and Apelles called him a fiery angel, and he's around, and he just is calling himself God, and he got control of one nation, on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, and basically convinced them that he was God, and then over a long process convinced them that he was the universal God. And but he's always been an angel, and in fact, all the nations have angelic rulers.
Mhm.
Just some of those angels are more, shall we say, ambitious than others. And this is, where we are. But they're all angels, and uh, the high God, the principle, the true God, has always been over this system. And Marcionites disagree about how involved that God might be. Of course, the heresiologists depict him as sort of waking up and sending Jesus, but that's not true. I think Christians have always tried to imagine God as trying to be involved, and Marcionites eventually come to a position that, yeah, the true God did create our soul or our spirit, and that's why He has every right to intervene, or she or it or whatever, and we are meant to get beyond the angels. So in effect, like, the structure of Marcionite thought is really not so much different than the structure of Orthodox or early Catholic thought, where you have the level of humanity, a daimonic or demonic level, where, as we call them today, intermediate beings hang out, angels and demons, or demones. And then you have the upper story. They all have that basic structure. It's just that, for Marcion, the creator of matter is in the middle level, rather than the high level, because they refuse to square that circle, right? They're more Platonic in this sense that, you know the high God, it's not his job to act like a craftsman. Like he's got better things to do, like to think about himself. I mean, and I'm being somewhat facetious, but I mean, they really did kind of think that the dirty work of creation that's done by angels anyway, and that was long part of Jewish tradition, and we see that in Philo.
Hmm.
And so, it's not like some radical new innovation. Um, it's a it's just a position that was potentially there and always there, ready for people to take. I think it's shocking to many people today in a way that it wouldn't be shocking in antiquity, because we've had now 2,000 years of monotheism, you know um, but it is what it is, and I hate it. I always put this as kind of like a disclaimer, like, unfortunately, people today can use Marcionism for really evil and devious ends, like being anti-Jewish and anti whatever. Um, and I think, you know, that is the case, but I think the Marcionite goal is really not to beat on the Jews, actually. They're really more interested, like they think all the nations are misled by angels, and they're just more interested in getting at the true God. They have a utopian style of religion, which is very common in late antiquity, that we don't belong in this world. We are above this world. We're trying to get out of this world, and we're engaging in an ascesis, or a technology of the self, which disciplines the body and helps us to get out. I mean, even Tertullian said this, right? He said that, the purpose of living in this world is to get quickly out of it.
Hmm.
And that's a very common position. And these people love God. They're trying to get at the truth. They think that God loves them. They think that God is love. And you know anything any religion can be used for evil and devious ends, but Marcionism, I think especially, is always in danger of being appropriated by people who really aren't concerned about God at all, but are more concerned about dissing other people. Anyway, my
Yeah, no,
personal.
it's. I think it's a very important point to say that anti-Semitism is not what is on the agenda for Marcionism. Anti-Semitism is the result of actual Orthodox Christianity milieu. Like that, it grew up in the Western European milieu around conspiracy theories around the blood libel. I think it's
Right,
completely conceivable to be anti-Judaism. Nietzsche is a great example of a philosopher who was vociferously against Judaism and also decisively broke with people like Wagner over anti-Semitism.
right,
I think that
exactly,
those
yeah.
things are logically not connected. It's hard to imagine them, of course, after the Holocaust. But I think it's very important to say that criticisms of Judaism are not anti-Semitism. And I don't think that Nietzsche was an anti-Semite. I think he was an opponent of anti-Semite. And I think if you were to talk to Marcion and ask him, should you hate the Jews? I think that Marcion would have told you, no, the Jews are actually a victim of a deception, that they deserve, to the truth as much as anyone else, maybe more so than anyone else. And so I think
Absolutely,
that
yeah.
so yeah, I don't think that anyone who's using Marcion as an excuse to be an anti-Semite is badly misreading Marcionite theology. I
I
think
think so,
Marcion would
yeah.
have had a great deal of pity. And again, I'm not justifying Marcionism. I'm just saying I think that one doesn't get the sense of any sort of hatred of Jewish people in the least when you read the history of Marcionism, any more than you get of the normal sort of Christian idea that the Jews have been blind or are not seeing things or tricked or otherwise ignorant. And of course, that becomes an important foundation stone for anti-Semitism. But I think projecting back those kinds of distinctly European ideas onto a Anatolian theologian, I think that would be bogus.
Yeah, and just as a final coda there, there's people today like Marcus Vincent and Harnack who said that Marcion was probably Jewish, and I think that they're wrong about that. But the heresiologists, or we at least know that it's a fact that the heresiologists thought that Marcion was allied with the Jews,
Hmm.
because he read the Septuagint really well. He knew it really well, and he read it in a literal way. And so he must have got it from the Jews. And the fact is, maybe he did. Like,
I don't know.
like
Reading the Hebrew Bible literally is the least Jewish thing imaginable to me. I,
fair enough. Yeah, fair
I
enough.
think that him reading it the way he did is proof that he wasn't Jewish. I mean, if you ever had to, I mean, of course you have read through the tortured allegories of someone like Philo. Yeah, I think that him reading it literally, it was like, yeah, you're not us. um,
Fair
yeah,
enough.
to take, yeah. But David, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the channel, and it's always a great, again, this is what I love about having this platform is that I can just email my friends and colleagues and say, "Hey, man, you're free to talk about Marcion, the Demiurge, and Hermeticism," and it's sort of the grab bag of the one of the amazing things that your scholarship is just does so well, and also the fact that you're investing so much into outward facing scholarship that is accessible to so many people. It's just a pleasure to know you, and real great opportunity and honor on my part to be able to host you and pick your brain about these topics as we get a little bit more nerdy about these things as outside of a regularly scheduled esoteric episode. So first, let me just thank you for your scholarship, both your academic scholarship, but also your public reaching education scholarship. And let me just encourage folks, check out Dr. Litwa's stuff. Check out his books. I know sometimes they can be expensive, and that's not his fault. That's because he is a victim of the archons, as we all are. But check out his stuff. Check out his fantastic his classes that are, again, like, just shockingly affordably priced. If you look at the price per credit hour in the United States, what people pay for a upper level graduate level class or an upper level undergraduate class, it's just it's malevolent what they're charged to get an education, and the fact that Dr. Lit was doing the work of making that stuff accessible. Just kol hakavod, as we say in Hebrew. More power to you. And again, where can folks find you? Where can folks support your work? Where can people get access to the learning that you're making accessible in such a great way?
Well, I appreciate that. And, I think you've worked very hard in Esoterica to get a platform that has such a large audience. It shows that there's a great thirst. I am very far behind you in that respect, but I'm very grateful um, to, yeah, come in and interact with your audience. Um, Definitely, you can see me over Patreon. Again, I've got a website. It's just my name, mdavidlitwa.com. I've got all my courses there, the descriptions. I've got a blog. I've got basically a database that summarizes all the most recent scholarship in New Testament early Christianity, both books and articles. Because the fact is, people just don't read those expensive books, and they don't read academic journal articles. That's just a fact. So that stuff is inaccessible to people, and so I've made it accessible. I do have to eat. I unfortunately I will be probably forced to leave my academic job due to things not under my control, visa issues actually. Um, so that's in the works. It would be great, when I needed to leave, to just not need to claw my way back into the job market, but to depend on people such as you who just want affordable stuff. Listen, I've got over a dozen books in print, and I've worked very, very hard to put, I believe it's now 8 books on Audible, which means that you can listen to them anytime, and they all are under 20 US dollars. Most of them are under 15. So check that out. Be aware that, for the Marcion course, I've offered a discount to everybody at Esoterica. I will offer that same discount for my Hermetica course. So I'm going to give Dr. Sledge the code. You can use that code when you check out and get 20% off the course. And it's yours forever. And I've worked very hard on getting dozens of lectures up there with readings, and it's has to be a labor of love because I'm not getting much back from it. But I'm hopeful that as the word gets out, that material will be more and more used. Frankly, yes, you can spend $3,000 for, a course, but to be honest, the Hermetica really isn't being taught really anywhere except maybe Amsterdam. I mean, maybe I don't know. I mean, you would probably have to move somewhere very far, but it's here. It's available. So look out for the translation, and yeah, check out what I have to offer. That's all I ask, and if you can benefit from it, that's super. Really appreciate it.
Yep, folks. This is we're living again. We're increasingly living in the golden age of education, access to education on these kinds of topics, because of folks like Dr. Litwa who are making this stuff accessible at a very affordable, a very fair price. And so, again, I'd highly encourage you. Patronize the people that you care about, and patronize them not just because you care about them. Patronize them because they're offering education at an extremely high level, I think prices that are extremely affordable. But Dr. Litwa, thank you so much for your scholarship, for your work, and for hanging out with me and chatting about these things that we both care about deeply, and this audience also I think cares about deeply as well.
Appreciate it very much. Yep. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
All right, folks. Well, of course, more topics like this to come. And again, we're building this community of scholars and teachers and academics and practitioners too. I'd love to have our practitioner folks on the channel as well. And so stay tuned for more conversations like these. So until next time, thank you so much.